April 14th, 1945. North Atlantic, 280 miles southeast of Cape Cod. 06:23 hours. The black waters of the North Atlantic churned, with the violence of a spring storm. U-858, a Type 9C German submarine, wallowed helplessly on the surface. Her diesel engines had failed. 3 hours earlier, leaving the 252-foot vessel at the mercy of 20-foot swells, that crashed over her conning tower. With relentless fury, inside the cramped control room, Captain Lieutenant Thilo Bode struggled to maintain his composure as seawater poured through damaged hatches and electrical systems sparked and failed around him. The submarine that had once been the pride of the Kriegsmarine, capable of striking terror into Allied convoys across 2 oceans, was now nothing more than a steel coffin, drifting towards certain destruction. In the frigid Atlantic depths, 43 German sailors crowded into the forward compartments as the stern began to settle lower in the water, taking on thousands of gallons through compromised hull plates that had been weakened by months of depth charge attacks and emergency dives. The acrid smell of battery acid, mixed with diesel fuel and human fear, created an atmosphere of desperation that no amount of naval training could overcome. Oberbootsman Wilhelm Hoffmann, a veteran of 37 combat patrols, pressed his face against a periscope and watched the gray dawn light reveal empty ocean, stretching to every horizon. No rescue ships appeared on the distant waves, only the endless, indifferent sea that had claimed so many of their comrades during nearly 6 years of submarine warfare. What these German submariners could not have imagined, as they prepared for what seemed like certain death in the cold Atlantic waters, was that salvation would come from the most unexpected source: American fishermen, who would risk their own lives to save the very enemies who had spent years sinking American merchant vessels and killing American sailors, the life preservers that would soon be thrown to drowning German sailors, bore the names of fishing boats from Gloucester, Massachusetts, vessels crewed by men whose brothers, sons, and neighbors had died under the guns and torpedoes of German U-boats. Yet when faced with fellow human beings, struggling against the sea's merciless embrace, these American fishermen would demonstrate a humanity that Nazi ideology had declared impossible in a racially mixed democracy. The orange life rings that bobbed in the churning waters would become more than simple rescue equipment. They would represent the fundamental moral divide between societies built on human dignity and those constructed on racial hatred and ideological fanaticism. In the buoyancy of those simple, cork-filled circles lay the essence of American values that had sustained democracy through its darkest hours and would ultimately prove more durable than the steel hulls of Nazi warships or the iron discipline of totalitarian military organizations. The warmth of American rescue blankets would provide more than physical comfort. To hypothermic German sailors, it would offer proof that democratic societies possessed moral strengths that authoritarian regimes could neither understand nor replicate. This moment of unexpected salvation in the storm-tossed North Atlantic represented the collision of 2 irreconcilable worldviews that had shaped the most devastating conflict in human history. For German submariners who had been conditioned to view Americans as racially inferior enemies, deserving of death, the experience of being saved by the very people they had tried to kill would initiate a psychological transformation that challenged every assumption Nazi propaganda had planted in their minds. The simple act of American fishermen risking their lives to save drowning enemies would prove more powerful than years of ideological indoctrination, demonstrating that human decency could transcend the artificial barriers of nationality, race, and political allegiance that totalitarian systems used to justify hatred and war. The strategic situation in April 1945 had rendered German submarine operations increasingly desperate and ultimately futile as the Third Reich collapsed under the combined pressure of Allied advances on all fronts. The Battle of the Atlantic, which had once threatened to strangle Britain's supply lines and force a negotiated peace favorable to Germany, had been decisively won by Allied forces through a combination of technological innovation, industrial production, and tactical adaptation that German naval commanders had failed to anticipate or counter effectively. By spring 1945, German U-boats were operating under conditions that made survival extremely unlikely and military success virtually impossible. The German submarine force that had begun the war with such devastating effectiveness had been systematically destroyed through 3 years of increasingly sophisticated Allied anti-submarine warfare. Of the 1,062 U-boats commissioned by the Kriegsmarine during World War II, over 780 had been sunk by April 1945, with casualty rates among submarine crews exceeding 70%, higher than any other branch of the German military. The technological advantages that had initially favored German submarines, superior torpedo design, advanced diesel engines, and experienced crews, had been negated by Allied innovations, including improved radar, sonar systems, escort carriers, and long-range patrol aircraft that could track and attack submerged vessels with unprecedented accuracy. The evolution of Allied anti-submarine warfare represented one of the most complete technological and tactical transformations achieved during World War II, fundamentally altering the balance of power in the Atlantic theater. Through systematic application of scientific research, industrial production, and operational experience, British and American scientists had developed increasingly sophisticated detection systems that could locate submerged submarines through multiple methods, including radar, sonar, magnetic anomaly detection, and high-frequency direction finding that triangulated German radio transmissions. These technological innovations were supported by industrial production programs that manufactured detection equipment, patrol aircraft, and escort vessels in quantities that overwhelmed German countermeasures. Most critically, Allied code-breaking operations, centered at Bletchley Park in Britain, had penetrated German naval communications so thoroughly that submarine positions, patrol routes, and attack plans were often known to Allied commanders before German crews received their operational orders. The Enigma cipher system that German naval forces believed provided unbreakable communication security had been compromised through a combination of captured equipment, mathematical analysis, and early computer technology that enabled Allied intelligence services to decrypt German messages in near real time. This intelligence advantage allowed Allied forces to redirect convoys away from German submarine patrol areas, while concentrating anti-submarine forces against known U-boat positions. U-858, commissioned in September 1943 at the Havelswerke shipyard in Kiel, represented the pinnacle of German submarine technology, incorporating improvements based on 3 years of combat experience, including increased diving depth, enhanced torpedo storage, improved crew accommodations, and advanced battery systems that extended submerged endurance. The Type 1AC design had been optimized for long-range operations in distant waters, with fuel capacity sufficient for patrols lasting up to 16 weeks, and torpedo loads that could engage multiple convoy targets during a single mission. Yet these technical refinements could not overcome the fundamental strategic reality that German submarine operations had become suicidal missions with minimal prospect of achieving meaningful military objectives. The construction of U-858 had required critical materials, including high-grade steel, precision machinery, and electronic components that were becoming increasingly scarce, as Allied bombing campaigns targeted German industrial facilities and transportation networks. The submarine's diesel engines incorporated synthetic materials and substitute alloys that reduced performance and reliability compared to earlier boats, built with optimal specifications. Most significantly, the experienced technicians, engineers, and skilled workers who had built Germany's early submarines had been conscripted for military service or killed in bombing raids, forcing shipyards to rely on forced laborers and inexperienced workers whose craftsmanship could not match pre-war standards. Captain Lieutenant Bode had assumed command of U-858 in January 1945, knowing that his chances of surviving a combat patrol were less than 1 in 3. Based on casualty statistics that German Naval Command could no longer conceal from submarine crews at 26 years old, he was already considered a veteran commander, having served as first officer on 2 previous submarines that had been sunk by Allied forces, with minimal survivors. His own survival had been attributed to luck rather than skill, a recognition that haunted experienced submarine officers who understood that German tactical doctrine could no longer provide reliable protection against Allied anti-submarine capabilities. His crew consisted largely of teenage conscripts who had received minimal training due to fuel shortages that limited practical exercises and the destruction of training facilities by Allied bombing. The experienced petty officers and technical specialists who had formed the backbone of the U-boat service in earlier years had been killed in steadily mounting numbers that Germany's shrinking training programs could not replace. Chief Engineer Obermaschinist Franz Müller, at 34, was among the oldest crew members, having survived 4 previous patrols. Through a combination of technical expertise and cautious seamanship that younger officers sometimes criticized as excessive caution, the typical German submarine crew of 1945 reflected the broader manpower crisis facing all branches of the German military, as casualty rates exceeded replacement capacity, and younger conscripts entered service with inadequate preparation for the technical and psychological demands of submarine warfare. Many crew members had been transferred from surface vessels, coastal artillery units, or even infantry formations with minimal additional training in submarine-specific procedures. This lack of specialized knowledge created dangerous situations during emergency operations, when split-second decisions and precise coordination could determine whether the boat survived depth charge attacks or mechanical failures. The mission that had brought U-858 to American coastal waters was part of Operation Seawolf, a final desperate attempt by German Naval Command to disrupt Allied shipping lanes and demonstrate continued German resistance even as the Reich collapsed. Under Allied invasion from east and west, intelligence reports had indicated increased convoy traffic along the American East Coast as the United States accelerated shipments of men and materials to support the final push into Germany. German admirals hoped that renewed submarine attacks in American waters might force the diversion of Allied escort vessels from European operations, potentially slowing the Allied advance and providing time for German scientists to complete development of revolutionary weapons that might yet alter the war's outcome. The strategic delusion underlying Operation Seawolf reflected the disconnect between German naval leadership and operational reality that had characterized German military planning. Throughout the final years of the war, Admiral Karl Dönitz, commanding the German submarine force, continued to believe that determined attacks against Allied shipping could achieve decisive results, despite overwhelming evidence that German submarines were being destroyed faster than they could sink enemy vessels. Statistical analysis available to German naval staff demonstrated conclusively that each German submarine sunk cost Allied forces less tonnage than the submarine could have sunk during its operational lifetime. Yet these calculations were ignored in favor of ideological commitments to continued resistance. The reality confronting German submarine commanders in 1945 bore no resemblance to the optimistic assessments provided by naval headquarters in Berlin. Allied anti-submarine defenses along the American coast had been perfected through 3 years of constant refinement and technological innovation that had transformed coastal waters from hunting grounds into killing zones, where German submarines faced overwhelming disadvantages in detection, firepower, and tactical mobility. Radar networks provided continuous surveillance of coastal waters, with resolution sufficient to detect submarine periscopes and snorkels at ranges exceeding 20 miles. Patrol aircraft equipped with advanced detection equipment could locate submerged submarines through magnetic anomaly detection systems that identified the metallic mass of submarine hulls against the natural magnetic background of seawater. Improved sonar buoys dropped by aircraft created acoustic barriers that could track submarine movements across hundreds of square miles of ocean. Most critically, escort carriers operating with hunter-killer groups had eliminated the sanctuary of mid-ocean areas where German submarines had previously operated, beyond the range of land-based aircraft. The patrol that would end with U-858's crew, struggling for survival in the North Atlantic, had begun with mechanical problems that plagued the submarine from the moment it departed its base at Bergen, Norway. On March 8, 1945, diesel engine malfunctions had forced the boat to operate on battery power for extended periods, limiting its range and submerged endurance, while creating noise signatures that made detection by Allied sonar systems more likely. Electrical systems that controlled diving operations and torpedo firing mechanisms had shown signs of failure that worsened as the patrol continued, requiring constant maintenance by crew members who lacked spare parts and proper testing equipment. Most ominously, the submarine's hull had developed stress fractures around the forward torpedo room that allowed seawater to enter at depths greater than 150 feet, forcing the crew to operate at shallow depths that made them vulnerable to air attack, while limiting their ability to escape detection through deep diving. These structural problems reflected manufacturing defects that had become increasingly common as German shipyards struggled with material shortages, inexperienced workers, and accelerated production schedules that sacrificed quality for quantity in desperate attempts to replace submarine losses. The deteriorating condition of German submarine technology was matched by declining crew morale, as experienced sailors recognized that their missions had become suicide operations, with minimal chances of achieving meaningful military objectives. Intelligence reports from returned patrols described Allied anti-submarine capabilities that made successful attacks extremely difficult, while virtually guaranteeing detection and counterattack. Young crew members who had been indoctrinated with Nazi ideology about German technical superiority and racial destiny found their beliefs challenged by the reality of obsolete equipment, inadequate training, and strategic situations that offered no prospect of victory. Despite these mechanical problems and declining morale, Bode had pressed forward with his mission, knowing that returning to base without achieving any military objectives would result in court-martial proceedings that might end with execution for cowardice or dereliction of duty. The Nazi regime's increasingly draconian military justice system had eliminated any possibility of acknowledging the hopeless strategic situation facing German naval forces. Submarine commanders were expected to achieve impossible objectives with inadequate equipment, while maintaining crew morale through pure force of will and ideological commitment to National Socialist principles. That had lost credibility among experienced military personnel. The American fishing fleet that would ultimately rescue U-858's crew represented a maritime tradition that had sustained New England communities for over 3 centuries, creating cultural values and practical skills that proved invaluable during wartime service to the Allied cause. The waters off Cape Cod had been fished by generations of American families whose knowledge of local currents, weather patterns, and seasonal fish migrations made them uniquely qualified to operate in conditions that challenged even experienced naval personnel. These civilian mariners possessed seamanship skills that had been developed through lifetimes of practical experience in some of the world's most dangerous waters. The transition from peacetime fishing to wartime auxiliary service had been accomplished with remarkable efficiency, as fishing vessel owners volunteered their boats and crews for dangerous duty with the Coast Guard Auxiliary and Naval Reserve. These civilian volunteers understood that their local knowledge and maritime expertise were essential for coastal defense operations that required detailed familiarity with offshore waters, hidden reefs, and seasonal weather patterns that could affect naval operations. Many had already rescued survivors from merchant vessels torpedoed by German submarines, gaining first-hand experience with the realities of submarine warfare and its human costs. Captain Joseph Santos of the fishing vessel, Mary Catherine, embodied the immigrant traditions that had shaped American maritime communities, while demonstrating the patriotic commitment that motivated civilian participation in the war effort. The 43-year-old Portuguese-American fisherman had emigrated from the Azores as a child, learning English in Massachusetts public schools while maintaining cultural connections to his family's maritime heritage. His success as an independent fishing boat owner represented the economic opportunities available in American democratic society, where individual initiative and hard work could achieve prosperity and social advancement, regardless of ethnic background or family origins. Santos had lost 2 nephews to German U-boat attacks on merchant vessels, young men who had served as merchant seamen, carrying vital supplies to Britain during the darkest days of the Battle of the Atlantic. Their deaths had provided personal motivation for his volunteer service with coastal patrol operations, yet his response to German distress calls would demonstrate that personal grief could be overcome by humanitarian principles that transcended desires for revenge. His decision to alter course toward U-858's position, when it became clear that German sailors were in imminent danger of drowning, reflected moral courage and adherence to maritime traditions that placed human life above considerations of nationality or military allegiance. His crew of 6 men, all of whom had personal reasons to hate German submarines, voted unanimously to attempt a rescue operation, despite the obvious risks involved in approaching a potentially armed enemy vessel. First Mate Antonio Silva had served in the Merchant Marine during the early years of the war, surviving 2 torpedo attacks that had killed shipmates and friends. Radio operator Patrick O'Malley had lost his brother when a German submarine sank the merchant vessel, City of New York. In 1942, engineer Giuseppe Romano's cousin had died when U-123 attacked the tanker Norness off Long Island. In January 1942, one of the first casualties of Operation Drumbeat, that brought submarine warfare to American coastal waters. Yet, despite these personal losses and their intimate knowledge of German submarine tactics, the crew of the Mary Catherine chose to respond to maritime distress calls, according to traditions that placed human life above all other considerations, including national loyalty, personal safety, and desires for revenge against enemies who had killed their family members and friends. Their decision reflected cultural values that had been shaped by centuries of maritime experience, in which the obligation to save lives at sea transcended all other considerations, creating moral imperatives that proved stronger than wartime hatred or propaganda campaigns that portrayed German submarine crews as murderous pirates who deserved no mercy from their intended victims. The the decision to rescue drowning German submariners, also reflected practical understanding of maritime dangers. That created common interests among all sailors, regardless of nationality or military service. New England fishing communities had developed traditions of mutual assistance that recognized the sea as a common enemy, against which all mariners shared fundamental interests in survival and safe navigation. These cultural imperatives had been reinforced through generations of experience with shipwrecks, storms, and accidents. That demonstrated the arbitrary nature of maritime disasters and the universal vulnerability of human beings to forces beyond their control. Santos and his crew understood the tactical situation. With perfect clarity, they were approaching an enemy submarine whose crew had spent years sinking American vessels and killing American sailors. Intelligence briefings had warned fishing boat captains that German submarines might use distress calls to lure rescue vessels within range of torpedo attacks or deck gunfire, tactics that had been employed successfully against merchant vessels that responded to false SOS signals. Previous incidents had demonstrated that some German commanders were willing to machine gun survivors from sunken ships, violating international maritime law and established traditions of naval warfare that protected non-combatants and shipwreck survivors. The risks involved in approaching a potentially armed enemy submarine were compounded by weather conditions that made maneuvering dangerous, even under normal circumstances. 20-foot swells and winds gusting to 40 knots created conditions that challenged the seamanship of experienced fishing boat crews, while making rescue operations extremely hazardous for both rescuers and survivors. The Mary Catherine would need to approach close enough to the sinking submarine to retrieve survivors from the water, while avoiding collision with wreckage or debris that could damage her hull and endanger her own crew. Yet despite these risks and their personal losses to German submarine attacks, the American fishermen chose to respond to maritime distress calls according to traditions that placed human life above considerations of nationality or military allegiance. Their behavior demonstrated moral qualities that Nazi ideology claimed were impossible in racially diverse democratic societies, where different ethnic groups supposedly competed destructively for resources and political advantage. The unanimous decision to attempt rescue operations reflected cultural assimilation processes that had created shared American values among immigrants from different backgrounds, while preserving beneficial aspects of their diverse cultural traditions. The first German sailors to be pulled from the frigid Atlantic waters were unconscious from hypothermia and shock, their gray uniforms sodden with seawater and diesel fuel that had leaked from their sinking submarine. The temperature of North Atlantic waters in April rarely exceeded 40 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to cause death from hypothermia within 30 minutes. For individuals without protective clothing or flotation devices, survival time was further reduced by the physical exhaustion that resulted from swimming in heavy seas, while wearing waterlogged uniforms and life jackets that provided minimal insulation against heat loss. Ordinary seaman Klaus Weber, barely 18 years old, had been in the water for over 20 minutes when American hands lifted him onto the deck of the Mary Catherine. His core body temperature had dropped to dangerous levels that threatened cardiac arrest, while prolonged immersion in salt water had begun to damage his skin and respiratory system. The early stages of hypothermia had impaired his coordination and judgment, making it impossible for him to help with his own rescue or follow instructions from his rescuers. His blue-tinged lips and fingernails indicated oxygen deprivation that could cause permanent organ damage if not treated immediately with warming techniques and medical attention. The American fishermen immediately began emergency treatment, using techniques learned through Coast Guard training and practical experience with maritime accidents that were unfortunately common In New England fishing operations, hot blankets were applied to Weber's torso to warm his core temperature, while avoiding rapid rewarming of extremities. That could cause dangerous cardiac arrhythmias. Warm beverages were prepared carefully to avoid scalding damaged throat tissues, while providing internal heat sources that could help restore normal body temperature. Most importantly, continuous monitoring of vital signs ensured that medical complications could be identified and treated before they became life-threatening. The medical knowledge demonstrated by American fishing crews reflected training programs that had been developed through collaboration between Coast Guard medical specialists and civilian maritime organizations. These educational initiatives had distributed first aid knowledge and emergency medical equipment throughout American fishing fleets, creating capabilities that often exceeded those available to military personnel operating far from medical facilities. The investment in civilian medical training represented broader American commitments to protecting human life and maintaining community resilience that characterized democratic approaches to civil defense and emergency preparedness. The orange life preservers that kept German sailors afloat during their rescue carried symbolic significance that transcended their practical function. As life-saving equipment, each preserver bore stenciled identification marks, indicating its origin from American fishing vessels, Coast Guard stations, or merchant ships that had been equipped through American industrial production systems, operating at unprecedented levels of efficiency and output. The cork filling that provided buoyancy had been harvested from Mediterranean oak trees and processed in American factories that maintained quality standards. Despite wartime pressures to maximize production speed and minimize costs, the canvas covering had been woven from American cotton, grown in fields worked by free laborers, earning wages that enabled them to purchase consumer goods produced by the same industrial system that manufactured their work equipment. The bright orange dye had been synthesized in American chemical plants using processes that demonstrated advanced organic chemistry knowledge and industrial capabilities. Even the metal hardware that secured the life preserver straps had been manufactured to specifications that ensured reliability under extreme conditions, reflecting quality control standards and materials science expertise that exceeded anything available to German military procurement systems. Most significantly, these life preservers represented American abundance that made it possible to equip even small fishing vessels with safety equipment that exceeded international maritime requirements and military specifications used by German naval forces. American fishing boats routinely carried more life-saving equipment than was required by law, reflecting both regulatory standards that prioritized crew safety and economic prosperity that enabled vessel owners to invest in equipment that enhanced operational safety margins. German submarines, by contrast, carried minimal life-saving equipment due to space constraints and resource shortages. That had worsened as the war progressed, and material allocations prioritized offensive weapons over defensive safety systems. The contrast between American abundance and German scarcity was visible in every aspect of the rescue operation, from the quantity and quality of emergency equipment to the medical supplies and warm clothing that American fishermen freely shared with their former enemies. German naval regulations specified life preserver allocations based on crew size and operational requirements, but actual equipment often fell short of requirements due to manufacturing priorities that favored torpedo production over crew protection systems. The psychological impact of observing American abundance in life-saving equipment was profound for German sailors, who had become accustomed to shortages and substitutions that compromised their safety and operational effectiveness. The transformation of German attitudes toward Americans began immediately as hypothermic submariners experienced kindness, where they had expected brutality based on Nazi propaganda that portrayed Americans as savage barbarians who tortured prisoners and murdered wounded enemies, without regard for international law or humanitarian principles. Oberbootsman Hoffman, who had participated in attacks on American merchant vessels and witnessed the deaths of American seamen, found himself wrapped in blankets, donated by crew members of the Mary Catherine, while American hands administered hot coffee and medical attention. That probably saved his life. The cognitive dissonance created by receiving compassionate treatment from people he had been trained to kill initiated a psychological process that would ultimately lead him to renounce his Nazi beliefs and cooperate with American intelligence services. The immediate physical comfort provided by warm clothing and hot beverages was accompanied by emotional recognition that his rescuers were demonstrating moral qualities that contradicted everything Nazi ideology had taught him about American character and democratic society. The realization that American fishermen were risking their own lives to save German enemies challenged fundamental assumptions about racial superiority and ideological conflict that had justified years of submarine warfare against civilian targets. The medical care provided by American fishermen demonstrated practical competence and humanitarian concern that contradicted every assumption Nazi ideology had promoted about American character and democratic society. Captain Santos and his crew had received extensive first aid training through Coast Guard programs that emphasized treatment of hypothermia, shock, and traumatic injuries commonly associated with maritime accidents and combat operations. Their emergency medical supplies included medications, bandages, and warming equipment that exceeded anything available to German submarine crews, reflecting American industrial capacity and organizational priorities that placed human welfare above cost considerations. Even during wartime resource allocation, the systematic approach to medical treatment observed by German prisoners reflected educational programs and institutional support systems that enabled civilian personnel to provide sophisticated emergency care under challenging conditions. American fishing crews had access to medical reference materials, communication systems that enabled consultation with qualified physicians, and equipment that had been designed specifically for maritime emergency situations. The knowledge and competence demonstrated during rescue operations impressed German naval personnel who recognized professional medical capabilities that exceeded those available to their own submarine service. The warm clothing shared with rescued German sailors represented personal sacrifices by American fishermen who understood that their extra garments might be needed during extended patrols in harsh weather conditions. Wool sweaters knitted by fishermen's wives, waterproof jackets purchased with personal funds, and spare boots that had been accumulated over years of fishing operations were freely given to former enemies, without expectation of compensation or recognition. These personal items carried emotional significance as gifts from family members and represented economic investments that fishing families could not easily replace, given wartime shortages and rationing restrictions. The quality and quantity of clothing available for sharing with German prisoners demonstrated American living standards and industrial production capabilities that exceeded anything German submariners had observed during their naval service. Even working-class American fishing families possessed surplus clothing sufficient to outfit additional personnel during emergency situations, suggesting levels of prosperity and industrial output that contradicted Nazi propaganda about American economic weakness and social inequality. The wool used in American sweaters was of superior quality to materials available for German military uniforms, while synthetic fabrics and waterproof coatings represented technological innovations that German textile industries had been unable to match. These acts of generosity demonstrated moral qualities that Nazi racial theory claimed were impossible. In ethnically diverse democratic societies, where different groups supposedly competed destructively for resources and political advantage, The willingness of Portuguese American, Italian American, and Irish American fishing crews to share their personal possessions with German enemies contradicted Nazi theories about inevitable racial conflict and the inability of heterogeneous societies to maintain social solidarity under stress. The voluntary nature of these sacrifices proved more impressive to German observers than any amount of coercive organization could have achieved, demonstrating cultural values that enabled spontaneous cooperation and mutual assistance without government direction or ideological indoctrination. The quality of American fishing vessels and equipment, observed by German prisoners, provided additional evidence that challenged Nazi assessments of American industrial capabilities and economic sustainability. The Mary Catherine was equipped with radar systems that enabled navigation and fish location in conditions that would have prevented German fishing vessels from operating safely. Radio communications equipment provided reliable contact with other vessels and shore installations across distances that exceeded the range of German submarine communication systems. Navigation instruments included electronic devices and precision chronometers that demonstrated manufacturing capabilities and technological sophistication that German naval forces had not achieved. Despite years of military research and development, her diesel engines operated with reliability and efficiency that German submariners had not observed in their own boats for months, reflecting maintenance practices and parts availability that kept civilian vessels in better operating condition than military submarines operating under combat conditions. The engine room contained spare parts, specialized tools, and maintenance equipment that exceeded the resources available to German submarine crews, who were forced to improvise repairs with substitute materials and inadequate workshop facilities. Most impressively, the vessel's fuel tanks, food storage compartments, and spare parts inventory suggested logistical support systems that could maintain extended operations without the critical shortages that plagued German naval forces. American fishing boats operating in North Atlantic waters during April 1945 demonstrated technological sophistication and operational effectiveness that contradicted German intelligence estimates about American maritime capabilities and industrial production priorities. These civilian vessels incorporated innovations developed through 3 years of wartime experience, including improved hull designs for rough weather operations that enhanced seaworthiness and crew safety. Enhanced communication systems enabled coordination with military forces and other civilian vessels across wide areas of ocean, creating information networks that improved both fishing efficiency and naval intelligence gathering. Specialized equipment for rescue operations in hazardous conditions reflected investment in humanitarian capabilities that demonstrated American priorities and resource allocation decisions. The fact that such advanced technology was available to civilian fishing operations suggested industrial production capacity and technological development programs that exceeded anything Germany could achieve, even with slave labor and total mobilization of economic resources. German prisoners observed American fishing vessels that were better equipped than many German naval vessels, indicating industrial capabilities and resource distribution that contradicted Nazi assumptions about democratic inefficiency and competitive waste. The food provided to rescued German sailors revealed American abundance that seemed impossible to men whose own rations had been reduced to subsistence levels as German supply lines collapsed under Allied pressure and domestic agricultural production declined due to labor shortages and fertilizer scarcity. Hot soup prepared in the Mary Catherine's galley contained fresh vegetables that German submariners had not tasted for months, including potatoes, carrots, onions, and celery that had been preserved through processing techniques that maintained nutritional value and flavor. Fresh meat had been obtained from American suppliers, who continued to provide quality products, despite wartime rationing systems that nevertheless maintained adequate nutrition for civilian populations. Seasoning and spices that had become luxury items in Germany were used routinely in American cooking, demonstrating trade relationships and supply chains that continued to function effectively despite global warfare and transportation challenges. White bread baked that morning demonstrated access to wheat flour that had become unavailable to German civilians. By early 1945, while the quality of the flour and baking techniques produced bread superior to military rations provided to German naval personnel, fresh coffee served in ceramic cups represented luxury items that German naval personnel received only during rare periods of shore leave in occupied ports, where confiscated supplies might be temporarily available. The casual manner in which American fishermen shared their food supplies with former enemies provided the most powerful demonstration of democratic abundance and generosity that German prisoners had ever witnessed. These were not government-issued rations, distributed according to official regulations, but personal provisions purchased by individual fishermen who chose to share their privately owned resources with people who had recently been trying to kill them. The psychological impact of this voluntary generosity was far greater than any amount of official propaganda could have achieved, proving through direct experience that American democratic society had created levels of prosperity and moral development that totalitarian systems could not match. The abundance represented by freely shared food reflected agricultural and industrial systems that maintained civilian living standards while simultaneously supporting military forces operating on multiple continents. American food production had actually increased during the war years through mechanization, improved agricultural techniques, and fertilizer programs that enhanced productivity despite labor shortages caused by military conscription. The processing and distribution systems that delivered fresh food to fishing vessels operating hundreds of miles offshore demonstrated logistical capabilities and organizational efficiency that exceeded German military supply systems, operating much closer to their production sources. German submariners observed firsthand the ethnic diversity of American fishing crews that contradicted Nazi theories about inevitable racial conflict in heterogeneous societies. The Mary Catherine was crewed by men whose families had originated in Portugal, Italy, Ireland, and Nova Scotia, yet who worked together with remarkable efficiency and cooperation that exceeded the performance of German submarine crews, despite shared ethnic background and military training. Captain Santos spoke fluent English, despite having been born in the Azores, while his first mate traced his ancestry to Italian immigrants who had arrived in Massachusetts during the 1880s, seeking economic opportunities that American democratic society provided to hardworking individuals, regardless of their ethnic origins. The radio operator was the son of Irish immigrants who had fled poverty and political oppression in County Cork, finding in America the religious freedom and economic opportunity that had been denied them in their homeland. The engineer's grandparents had been French-Canadian Catholics who settled in New England mill towns, maintaining their cultural traditions while adapting to American social and economic systems that rewarded individual initiative and community participation. Each crew member represented successful cultural assimilation processes that had created shared American values while preserving beneficial aspects of diverse cultural traditions. This ethnic diversity, rather than creating the social chaos that Nazi ideology predicted, seemed to strengthen the crew's effectiveness by combining different cultural traditions and practical skills that enhanced collective capabilities. Portuguese experience with deep-water fishing operations complemented Italian knowledge of engine maintenance and mechanical systems while Irish familiarity with North Atlantic weather patterns. Enhanced navigation capabilities developed through French-Canadian traditions of maritime cooperation and community solidarity. Rather than competing destructively for dominance, these different cultural backgrounds contributed to collective capabilities that exceeded what any single ethnic group could have achieved independently. The religious diversity observed by German prisoners provided additional evidence that challenged Nazi assumptions about the relationship between cultural unity and social effectiveness. Captain Santos was a devout Catholic who crossed himself before beginning the rescue operation, demonstrating religious faith that provided moral guidance and emotional strength during dangerous situations. His first mate belonged to a Protestant denomination that emphasized social service and humanitarian assistance as expressions of Christian duty, while the radio operator attended a Catholic church where services were conducted in Latin, English, and Portuguese to accommodate parishioners from different immigrant communities who maintained distinct cultural traditions within shared religious frameworks. Yet despite these religious differences that Nazi ideology claimed would create irreconcilable conflicts, all crew members cooperated seamlessly in rescue operations that required precise coordination and mutual trust under dangerous conditions. Their shared commitment to humanitarian principles transcended theological differences, demonstrating that democratic societies could maintain social cohesion and collective effectiveness despite religious diversity that totalitarian ideologies considered divisive and destabilizing. The voluntary nature of their cooperation impressed German observers who recognized organizational capabilities that exceeded anything achieved through Nazi indoctrination and coercive control systems. American fishermen demonstrated practical competence in seamanship, navigation, and emergency operations that impressed German naval professionals who had been trained to consider themselves superior to civilian mariners in technical knowledge and operational effectiveness. The rescue operation required sophisticated maneuvering in heavy seas to position the fishing vessel close enough to retrieve survivors without risking collision with the sinking submarine or debris that could damage both vessels. Captain Santos displayed ship handling skills that matched or exceeded those of experienced German naval officers, while his crew demonstrated mechanical knowledge and emergency procedures that reflected extensive training and practical experience with maritime dangers. The precision with which American fishermen coordinated rescue operations under extremely hazardous conditions demonstrated seamanship capabilities that had been developed through generations of practical experience with some of the world's most dangerous waters. Their ability to maintain vessel position in heavy seas while conducting rescue operations required intimate knowledge of wind, current, and wave patterns, combined with mechanical skills that enabled precise control of engine power and steering systems. The safety with which they approached the sinking submarine and retrieved survivors reflected calculated risk assessment and emergency procedures that exceeded the capabilities of many military personnel. The technical sophistication of American fishing operations, observed by German prisoners, suggested civilian maritime industries that had benefited from technological innovations and training programs unavailable to German fishing fleets that had been disrupted by military conscription and resource shortages. American fishermen operated vessels equipped with hydraulic systems that reduced physical demands on crew members while increasing operational efficiency. Electronic navigation equipment provided position information and weather data that enhanced safety and productivity. Mechanical innovations, including winches, fish handling equipment, and processing systems, demonstrated industrial design capabilities and manufacturing quality that reflected broader American technological leadership. These technological advantages reflected broader American industrial capabilities that had enabled simultaneous expansion of both military and civilian production throughout the war years. contradicting Nazi assumptions about democratic inefficiency and resource allocation problems. German prisoners observed American civilian industries that had maintained technological development and capital investment programs, while supporting unprecedented military production requirements. The contrast between American civilian technological capabilities and German military equipment shortages demonstrated industrial production systems and economic management that exceeded anything achieved through Nazi central planning and coercive labor organization. German submariners also observed American organizational efficiency that contradicted Nazi propaganda about democratic chaos and individualistic selfishness that supposedly prevented effective collective action. The rescue operation was coordinated through radio communications with Coast Guard stations that provided weather information, navigation assistance, and medical advice without bureaucratic delays or authorization requirements. Multiple fishing vessels altered their positions to assist with the rescue without any apparent central command structure, yet their cooperation was more effective than German naval operations that relied on rigid hierarchical control systems and detailed operational orders. This spontaneous coordination suggested social institutions and cultural values that enabled complex collective action without coercive authority structures, demonstrating democratic capabilities that Nazi political theory claimed were impossible without totalitarian control systems. American fishermen made individual decisions based on shared values and practical knowledge that achieved collective objectives more efficiently than German military operations that required extensive planning, formal orders, and continuous supervision. The voluntary nature of American cooperation impressed German observers, who recognized organizational effectiveness that exceeded anything achieved through Nazi ideological indoctrination and hierarchical command structures. The psychological transformation of rescued German sailors accelerated as they spent hours aboard American fishing vessels, where they observed daily operations that contradicted every assumption Nazi ideology had promoted about American society and democratic institutions. Conversations with crew members revealed educational backgrounds, technical knowledge, and cultural sophistication that challenged German stereotypes about American intellectual capabilities and democratic educational systems. These fishermen discussed current events, military strategy, and political developments, with understanding that indicated access to information sources and educational opportunities that enabled informed participation in democratic governance. American crew members shared personal stories about family members serving in military forces, demonstrating pride in relatives who were fighting against German forces, while simultaneously showing compassion for German prisoners who represented the enemy. Their families were fighting. Community activities supporting the war effort included voluntary contributions of time and money for military production, civilian defense preparations, and humanitarian assistance. That reflected social solidarity and patriotic commitment that Nazi ideology claimed were impossible in individualistic democratic societies. Individual sacrifices made to support Allied victory included rationing compliance, war bond purchases, and acceptance of increased work responsibilities. That demonstrated collective commitment to defeating fascism. These narratives revealed social networks and collective commitments that contradicted Nazi claims about American individualism and lack of social solidarity. German prisoners observed Americans who demonstrated genuine concern for collective welfare, voluntary cooperation in achieving common objectives, and personal dedication to democratic values that exceeded anything achieved through Nazi indoctrination and coercive control systems. The spontaneous nature of American patriotic commitment impressed German observers, who recognized social cohesion and political loyalty that surpassed anything produced through totalitarian propaganda and state-controlled social organization. The treatment of German prisoners by American military personnel, who arrived to take custody of the rescued submariners, provided additional evidence of democratic institutions that maintained humanitarian standards, even under wartime conditions, that tested institutional resilience and moral commitment. Coast Guard officers who boarded the Mary Catherine to transfer German prisoners demonstrated professional competence and adherence to legal procedures that protected prisoner rights according to international conventions and American constitutional principles. Their behavior reflected training programs and institutional standards that emphasize legal compliance and humanitarian treatment, even for enemy combatants who had been engaged in warfare against American forces. Medical personnel who examined rescued German sailors provided immediate treatment for hypothermia and other injuries without regard to the prisoner's nationality or military service against American forces. American military medical standards maintained professional ethics and treatment protocols that recognized fundamental human dignity, regardless of political allegiance or military service. The quality of medical care provided to German prisoners equaled that available to American military personnel, demonstrating institutional commitment to humanitarian principles that transcended wartime emotions and desires for revenge against enemies who had killed American servicemen. The contrast between American adherence to legal and humanitarian standards and German treatment of captured enemy personnel created profound psychological impact on German prisoners who had witnessed or participated in violations of international law. During their submarine operations, Nazi military regulations had explicitly authorized attacks on civilian vessels, machine gunning of survivors, and other actions that violated established maritime law and humanitarian conventions that had governed naval warfare for centuries. German prisoners observed American forces that maintained higher ethical standards, while simultaneously demonstrating superior military effectiveness and technological capabilities that made Nazi violations of international law both morally inexcusable and strategically counterproductive. Processing procedures for German prisoners demonstrated American institutional efficiency and respect for legal procedures that impressed men who had experienced arbitrary authority and brutal treatment within German military organizations, where individual rights were subordinated to state ideology and military discipline. Each prisoner was interviewed individually, using procedures that protected their legal rights, while gathering intelligence information. According to established protocols, medical examinations were conducted by qualified personnel who provided treatment for existing health problems without regard to cost considerations or strategic value. Legal representation was assigned according to established procedures that recognized individual rights, even for enemy combatants who had been caught engaged in warfare against American forces. Administrative systems maintained accurate records that protected prisoners from administrative errors or deliberate mistreatment, while ensuring compliance with international conventions and American legal standards. Regular meals that met nutritional requirements were provided according to schedules that maintained prisoner health and demonstrated American abundance. Even in detention facilities, communication with International Red Cross representatives was enabled according to international agreements that protected prisoner rights and provided external oversight of detention conditions. The abundance of resources devoted to proper treatment of prisoners provided tangible evidence of American economic capabilities that could afford humanitarian considerations, even while fighting a global war on multiple fronts, against enemies who showed no similar restraint. In their treatment of captured personnel, German prisoners observed detention facilities that provided adequate housing, medical care, recreational opportunities, and educational programs that exceeded living standards available to German civilians. By 1945, this allocation of resources to prisoner welfare demonstrated economic productivity and institutional priorities that contradicted Nazi assumptions about democratic weakness and resource scarcity under wartime conditions. The intelligence debriefing process revealed American technological capabilities and organizational sophistication that exceeded German estimates of democratic institutional effectiveness and intelligence gathering capabilities. American interrogators demonstrated detailed knowledge of German submarine operations, technical specifications, and strategic planning that indicated intelligence gathering capabilities superior to German services that had been considered among the world's most effective. The questions asked during interviews revealed American understanding of German military organization, personnel policies, and operational procedures that German security services had believed were adequately protected from enemy intelligence penetration. Most significantly, American interrogators treated German prisoners with professional respect and adherence to legal constraints that contrasted sharply with Gestapo methods that relied on torture, intimidation, and psychological abuse to extract information from captured enemies. German submariners experienced interrogation procedures that followed established protocols designed to protect prisoner rights while achieving intelligence objectives through systematic questioning rather than physical coercion. This demonstration of professional competence within legal and ethical constraints proved more impressive to German prisoners than brutal methods they had witnessed within their own military system, suggesting institutional capabilities and moral development that exceeded anything achieved through totalitarian organization. The voluntary cooperation provided by German prisoners reflected genuine conversion to democratic values, rather than fear-based compliance, that characterized responses to Nazi interrogation methods. American interrogators achieved better intelligence results through professional competence and humane treatment than German services obtained through torture and intimidation, demonstrating practical advantages of democratic methods that respected human dignity while achieving legitimate security objectives. The effectiveness of American intelligence operations impressed German prisoners who recognized superior institutional capabilities that combined moral principles with operational effectiveness. The long-term impact of rescue and humane treatment by American forces proved more effective than any propaganda campaign in converting German military personnel to democratic values and opposition to Nazi ideology. Former members of U-858's crew became some of the most reliable sources of intelligence about German submarine operations, willingly providing information that helped Allied forces counter remaining German naval activities and protect merchant shipping from submarine attacks. Their cooperation was motivated not by coercion or fear, but by genuine conversion to democratic values and appreciation for American humanitarian treatment that had saved their lives when death seemed certain. Post-war interviews with rescued German submariners revealed the profound psychological impact of experiencing American kindness, where they had expected brutality based on Nazi propaganda and their own knowledge of German treatment of captured enemies. Ordinary Seaman Weber described his rescue by American fishermen as the beginning of his understanding that everything he had been taught about democratic societies was fundamentally false. The warmth of American blankets had provided more than physical comfort. It had offered evidence of moral qualities that Nazi ideology claimed were impossible in racially diverse democratic societies, where competing ethnic groups supposedly prevented social solidarity and collective action. The orange life preservers that had kept German sailors afloat during their rescue became symbols of American values that proved more durable than Nazi military hardware or ideological indoctrination systems that had seemed so powerful before German submariners experienced American humanitarian treatment firsthand. These simple pieces of cork and canvas represented industrial abundance that enabled American society to equip even civilian vessels with safety equipment that exceeded military specifications. used by German naval forces. The humanitarian concern demonstrated by American fishermen, who risked their own lives to save drowning enemies, reflected moral development and cultural values that totalitarian systems could neither create nor sustain through propaganda and indoctrination. The moral courage required for American fishermen to approach a potentially armed enemy submarine in order to save drowning German sailors demonstrated democratic values that transcended considerations of personal safety, national loyalty, and desires for revenge against enemies who had killed American merchant seamen. Their willingness to risk their lives for humanitarian principles represented cultural achievements that Nazi ideology claimed were impossible in competitive democratic societies, where individual self-interest supposedly prevented collective action and moral commitment to universal human rights. The fishing nets that Captain Santos and his crew had abandoned in order to conduct rescue operations symbolized economic sacrifices that American civilians freely accepted to support humanitarian principles and military objectives that transcended immediate financial interests. These Portuguese-American fishermen had invested thousands of dollars in equipment that they risked losing by responding to German distress calls, yet they never hesitated to prioritize human life above financial considerations that might have deterred individuals, motivated purely by economic self-interest. Their willingness to sacrifice personal economic interests for humanitarian objectives demonstrated moral qualities that totalitarian ideology claimed were impossible in competitive capitalist societies. The broader implications of this rescue operation extended far beyond individual humanitarian gestures to represent fundamental differences between democratic and totalitarian approaches to human dignity and international relations that would shape post-war reconstruction and Cold War competition. American fishermen who risked their lives to save drowning German enemies were acting according to cultural values that recognized universal human rights and obligations that transcended political boundaries and military conflicts. Their behavior demonstrated that democratic societies could maintain humanitarian principles, even under extreme conditions, that tested institutional resilience and moral commitment to values that distinguished civilization from barbarism. The abundance that enabled American fishing vessels to divert from commercial operations to conduct rescue missions reflected economic systems that created sufficient prosperity to support humanitarian activities, even during total war mobilization that strained resources and required maximum production efficiency. German submarine crews had observed American civilian vessels equipped with technology, supplies, and communication systems that exceeded military standards available to German naval forces, operating under optimal conditions. This material abundance suggested productive capacity and resource allocation priorities that contradicted Nazi theories about democratic inefficiency and competitive waste that supposedly prevented optimal utilization of national resources. Most significantly, the voluntary nature of American humanitarian assistance proved more impressive to German prisoners than any amount of coercive organization could have achieved through totalitarian methods that subordinated individual conscience to state ideology. American fishermen had chosen to risk their lives, saving former enemies without government orders, official rewards, or institutional pressure that might have motivated compliance with official policies, rather than genuine moral commitment. Their spontaneous generosity reflected cultural values and individual moral development that totalitarian systems could neither create nor sustain through propaganda and indoctrination programs that attempted to manufacture artificial loyalty and patriotic commitment. The rescue of U-858's crew thus became a microcosm of the broader ideological conflict that determined World War II's outcome, a demonstration that democratic societies possessed moral resources and economic capabilities. That enabled them to prevail not just through military force, but through the appeal of values that recognized human dignity as the foundation of legitimate political authority and social organization. The Orange life preservers that had saved German lives carried within their cork filling the buoyant principles of democracy that would keep civilization afloat through the storms of the 20th century and beyond, proving that societies built on human freedom and dignity possessed survival capabilities that no amount of military technology or ideological fanaticism could permanently overcome. In the end, the German submariners who had been pulled from the cold Atlantic waters carried with them more than their physical lives. They bore witness to the transformative power of democratic values that could convert enemies into allies through simple acts of human kindness and moral courage that transcended the artificial divisions of nationality, race, and political ideology that totalitarian systems use to justify hatred and war. The warmth of American rescue blankets had provided more than protection from hypothermia. It had offered refuge from the moral coldness of totalitarian ideology that viewed human beings as expendable resources in pursuit of racial and national supremacy, that had no foundation in reality or moral truth. In choosing compassion over revenge, generosity over suspicion, and human dignity over ideological hatred, American fishermen had demonstrated the enduring appeal of democratic civilization and its capacity to inspire hope, even in the darkest moments of human conflict, proving that the values of freedom, dignity, and mutual respect could triumph over the forces of tyranny, hatred, and dehumanization that had threatened to engulf the world in permanent darkness.